Hey all, Glenn Kirshner here. So friends, here is part 4, the final episode in my interview series with former Inspector General Bob Westbrooks. In this episode, we talk about how the Trump administration badly mangled the federal government's response to the COVID pandemic, and how Donald Trump in particular tried to cut the legs out from under the Inspector General community, even at one point saying that he, Donald Trump, will be the one to perform oversight. We also take on my belief that Donald Trump and his administration have criminal responsibility for avoidable COVID deaths. I hope you enjoy this 4th and final installment of my interview series with former Inspector General Bob Westbrooks.
I would say, quite honestly, the biggest thing that I fault the Trump administration for was their position on the Paycheck Protection Program data.
And the lack of transparency, which is exactly where I wanted to go with you next, because you quoted President Trump as saying, "I'll be the oversight for the CARES Act," which has echoes of him saying on the campaign trail in 2016, "I alone can fix it." That's sort of the opposite of what we need by way of oversight of the executive branch. So can you talk a little bit about the Trump administration's not just lack of transparency, but the way I was reading your book, it's like they're determined efforts to keep this information hidden?
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. And let me just preface this by saying in the book, I'm most proud of the fact that readers have said that it is a nonpartisan, objective, independent accounting. So later in the book, during the Biden administration, I do comment on some of the faults on overspending there. But in this instance, a couple things come to mind that I think are critically important. Number one, there was a famous press conference where President Trump said, "I'll be the oversight" when asked. And on Capitol Hill, immediately he said, no, you're not going to be the oversight. So I talked about that 7-day gestation period for the CARES Act. So members of Congress got busy drafting in. They go, well, we need to create an oversight entity. They reached back to the Recovery Act legislation. They pulled out a section. They said, let's create a pandemic response accountability committee. And so that's how we were formed. So he was overruled in that instance. Then there's this interesting concept of presidential signing statements, which they have sort of a fuzzy legal significance. But when a passed bill comes to the White House from Congress, the president, when he's signing the bill, can issue a signing statement, which is not part of the legislation, but reflects what his intentions are with that bill. And presidents of all stripes have used signing statements to opine on their policy views. Well, what was interesting with the CARES Act is President Trump said, okay, that's fine with the CARES Act, but the new IG for pandemic recovery is not to issue any oversight reports to Congress without them going through the White House. That was in the signing statement. Now, most commentators, myself included, that we were following this closely, we believe that the White House just screwed up. I think they meant to also include the PRAC, not just that special IG there was a special IG for a pot of money called the Special IG for Pandemic Recovery. He intended to block us as well. And why I think that is so is because after the CARES Act was created, the IG community named a chair, probably one of the most well-known IGs in IG history, a guy by the name of Glenn Fine, who was the former IG of the Department of Justice and did tremendous oversight of the FBI during his tenure. He was named the chair, and about a week later, the president removed him from his position as the acting IG of the Department of Defense so that he could no longer be eligible to be the chair of the PRAC. So within a week, he cut the legs out from under the PRAC, the Pandemic Oversight Accountability Committee. So we didn't have a chair.
What's the stated reason there, Bob?
None was given. And it was effective immediately. And of course, we had the community had a backup plan. So IG Michael Horowitz quietly assumed the chair role, and I was named the executive director shortly thereafter. But that's the environment I talked about when we initially started talking of, it was hard to find somebody gullible enough to say, yeah, I'm willing to do this. It was a chaotic environment. And then the final piece on this to talk about the administration, then you had, I talked about $346 billion in Paycheck Protection Program loans given out in 14 days. We wanted to know who got the money. American people wants to know who got the money. Well, the administration first said, we're not going to tell you. It's non-public data. We say, how is that possible? Oh, it's proprietary. We don't want to share information about American small businesses because their competitors can use that for an unfair competitive advantage. We said that's nonsense. So within a week, Chair Michael Horowitz and myself wrote a letter to the White House saying, we need more public reporting of data and access. We ultimately wrote a letter to Congress complaining, identifying this issue and raising it and asking for Congress's help. But initially, the White House wouldn't give the data. Then when they did give the data, they brokered a compromise. They said, okay, we'll give you the data, but all you're going to see publicly is if it's a loan under $150,000, we're going to redact the name. Not helpful. And if it's a loan over $150,000, we're just going to give tranche amounts. We're going to tell you it was in this range of loans. It was between $150,000 and $500,000, or between $500,000 and $1 million. They'd give these ranges so you wouldn't know the exact amount. And that is not helpful. I will say, I'd love to say and take credit for the fact that we got public transparency. But you know what it really was? It was the federal court system. And it goes to why I say IGs and federal judges are critically important. A federal judge in DC got a Freedom of Information Act litigation in front of him by the media that was saying the American public deserves and is entitled to see this data. The judge ultimately ruled in favor of the media. And at that time, of course, the election had already happened. So the prior administration kind of threw up their hands and pushed out the data. And that's when we got the data. The CARES Act was signed March 27, 2020. That data was not publicly available till December of 2020.
So once you are named the executive director of the PRAC, what are your main takeaways from your time? And how long were you in that position?
I was there like 2.5 years.
So what are your main takeaways about the challenges you had to contend with and what you were able to accomplish, which was pretty darn considerable given all the challenges you were facing, particularly from what often seemed to be a hostile administration?
Biggest takeaways, right, for me was on collaboration. Oversight's a team sport, just like justice is a team sport. And I love the model for Justice Matters. I mean, it takes a community, right, to come together. People have different skill sets and we complement each other. And so I look back, I'm most proud of the fact of finding new ways to collaborate, new ways to work with the Department of Justice, new ways to work with our federal law enforcement partners. And some of it, quite honestly, what did we have in terms of assets? In some instances, all we had was money. So how do we use our money wisely to fund? So giving an example is the DEA runs the leading intelligence office in federal government or federal law enforcement, the Fusion Center out in Merrifield, Virginia, that compiles criminal intelligence from a variety of sources, including Bank Secrecy Act data. And it's a hugely valuable intelligence network. Well, what can I do? I can't, I can at least dedicate a body to that. So I'll fund an FTE and place you at the Fusion Center and to help share information between the IGs. We hired a cadre of data scientists we used our hiring authorities to hire data scientists right out of colleges. Some of the leading colleges in America, we placed them with the IG offices, said, you can't hire your own data scientists, we'll hire them for you. And then we created a fraud task force and we said, okay, how can we share information and share agents and resources among all of the IG community? And I'm really proud of the way that we did that. But, starting the agency and starting it virtually, it's like, you're not building it to a future like, okay, well, let's do this work now because we know in 2 years from now, at some point, we're going to be in an office. I said, no, we're never going to be in an office. We're going to be working virtually, but let's lean into it. And we can actually hire the best people from around the country. Don't worry about what their zip code is. That's not a job qualification. But there's limitations to remote work. There's no doubt about that. And it takes considerable more effort to build a culture up front. You have to work out loud, as I like to say, because you can't assume anything. You don't have the benefit of walking down the hall into Glenn's office, the senior prosecutor, homicide chief, to say, hey, I got this case and I really don't know what to do with this witness. You don't have those opportunities, right, when you have a virtual environment. But I thought the collaboration was key. And what I was really proud of is one of the leading trade associations, the Association of Government Accountants, examined the oversight environment right around the time I was leaving office. And they said the work that we did in collaborating and working with data, sharing data across agencies and using the latest technology to mine data within data sets and to match data across data sets, they said that was a game changer for the IG community. They're never going back. And I was like, that's when I dropped the mic and said, it's time to move on. I can only screw it up from here. So
let me shift topics and just finish with this, which is more my bailiwick maybe than yours as a former career prosecutor, because some of the things that you wrote about just so resonated with me. For example, when you said Donald Trump's comments about bleach, when he said, we tested bleach, I can tell you that bleach will kill the virus in 5 minutes. And then he went on to say, he was ranting about shining ultraviolet light in the body, injecting disinfectant because it can be used to clean out the lungs. You say quite pointedly, words have consequences, especially words uttered by a president from the White House briefing room podium. Now, that is just one example of why I have long believed that there should be a criminal investigation open into the administration's responsibility for avoidable COVID deaths. In the District of Columbia, where we have entirely routine homicide laws, you're criminally responsible for the death of another under the involuntary manslaughter statute if there are 3 elements that a prosecutor can prove. 1, you acted in a grossly negligent way, or you had a duty to act and you failed to act, and that failure is a product of gross negligence. I contend Donald Trump satisfies that element in both ways, but even beyond gross negligence, he admitted he lied to us about the pandemic. The second element is that your grossly negligent act or failure to act is reasonably likely to result in death or serious bodily injury to another. When you're dealing with a deadly pandemic, I contend that element is easily satisfied. And the third element of the crime, and I know as a former postal inspector, you're familiar with having to prove each element of a crime beyond a reasonable doubt, often no easy task. The third element sounds like the most difficult to prove because it is that your grossly negligent act or failure to act that was reasonably likely to hurt another, thereby caused the death of another. People will say, oh, that's the sticking point. You can't prove that Donald Trump caused anybody's death until you look at the legal definition of causation in the homicide law and statutes. Causation is defined as conduct that is a substantial factor in bringing about the death, not that you shot or stabbed or bludgeoned or strangled someone, but that your conduct was a substantial factor in bringing about the death of another. And I analogize all the time to an actual case we had in my homicide section where a would-be robber was chasing a victim down the street. The victim ran between 2 parked cars, darted out into the street to avoid being robbed, was struck and killed by the car. The car killed him. The driver killed him. But whose conduct was a substantial factor in bringing about the death? The would-be robber. And that defendant we charged, and he was actually convicted of not just manslaughter, but second-degree murder. Donald Trump, by his lies, ran us all out into the oncoming pandemic, just as sure as that would-be robber ran his victim out into traffic. You know how many prosecutors I've talked to around the country, Bob, my friends and colleagues, who say, yeah, that's a good legal theory. And we think we may have the facts to support it and to prove those elements. But, right, there's always a but when it comes to holding accountable a ruling class criminal, particularly a former president of the United States. I throw that out there in frustration, and I will continue to throw it out to anybody who will listen. So thank you for listening. But from your perspective, which I know is not directly, the criminal law piece, do you have any thoughts, observations about that based on what you saw and what you experienced?
Yeah, I'm not a trial lawyer. I'm not a social scientist. I'm not a public health expert, but I do write in the book based upon my common sense and observations as a citizen. First of all, I source everything in the back of the book as the citations for all of the president's statements. So everything is well sourced. The mixed messages created an environment where I do believe contributed to why we had so many deaths and why we were among the largest number of deaths in the world. And when you have these environments where literally doctors were taking to social media to say, like, I can't take it anymore. I've got a patient who is convinced he doesn't have COVID because COVID's fake and he's fighting me and he's dead now. And we had an environment where, because of these public statements, and I also want to add one of my personal favorites is Senator Ted Cruz, who picked a fight with Big Bird on social media over vaccines, right? Which, did that discourage somebody from not getting a vaccine? I'm sure of it. Can I tell you with certainty? No. Can I tell you how many? No. But there are people that took that statement and think like, and it undermined our public's confidence in vaccine safety. So we lost all these people, but it's not just apathy that people like, I don't believe it. Mentally, we created this environment where people were hostile and adversarial to common sense measures of public health. That was the damage that was done. It wasn't just apathy. It was, now I'm angry with you for wearing a mask. And what did you see? You saw real consequences of this. You talk about reckless disregard. You had people threatening Fauci's life, criminal prosecutions of threatening the lives, convinced that they had to murder these public health officials who were just trying to save lives. That's the environment that all that misinformation from senior public officials, that's the effect of that, is you had a number of people, wrong-headed people, vulnerable people who took their words in and translated that into violent acts or expressions of violent acts. And other people died because they didn't take the threat serious enough. So I can't speak to whether you have a viable prosecution, but it angers me as an American.
Yeah. And if we decline to even try to hold accountable the folks responsible for it, we're giving permission to tomorrow's corrupt politician or aspiring dictator to do it all over again. And that's why, I get so frustrated and disheartened. Listen, I want to leave it there. We've been at this for a while, and I'm going to just reemphasize to everybody that if you want to learn a whole lot about how our government operated or failed to operate in handling this deadly pandemic, and if you want to be angered, but also given some optimism that we can do better, then I would recommend picking up Bob's book, Left Holding the Bag.
So friends, thanks for tuning in to this fourth and final installment in my interview series with former Inspector General Bob Westbrooks. If you want to purchase Bob's book, Left Holding the Bag, a Watchdog's account of how Washington fumbled its COVID test, I will put a link in the description of this video. So you can just click on the link and you can purchase Bob's book. I will tell you, it is an important read. I am so glad someone documented the way the Trump administration handled and mishandled the COVID pandemic and the relief money, our taxpayers' dollars that were spent trying to deal with that deadly pandemic. And friends, as always, please stay safe, please stay tuned, and I look forward to talking with you all again tomorrow.